Hi, this is Dr. Gaby Cora, and welcome to my show, Dr. Gaby's Take, Make Life Interesting. Hi, welcome to Season 1, Episode 8, Advocacy and Collaboration. And I have a wonderful guest today. We're going to be talking with Judge Leifman, who is the Miami-Dade County Court judge. And he has been such an advocate for the mentally ill, not only in Miami, but has also helped many people throughout different court systems across the United States. What is very interesting about Judge Leifman is that he is extremely personable and he's passionate about helping the mentally ill. And I believe that this is one of the main components to be able to bring all this together. The other things that you'll notice from the interview include his collaborative spirit, to realize that in order to make a huge impact, he really did need to bring people together. These two things, in addition for his passion for helping out, I think make a wonderful mix and contribution for this show that you're going to see, where we're going to be dealing with not only some of the surface issues around the criminal justice system, but also around issues around mental health, schizophrenia, bipolar illness, as well as substance abuse disorder, and how this can play a role in some of our people who are not doing well, who are mentally ill, and end up within the criminal system. I hope you will enjoy this show, and I look forward to your comments later on. Hi, I'm Dr. Gaby Cora, and I'm here with Judge Leifman in Miami, Florida, at the courthouse. So
Welcome.
glad to see you.
Thank you, and welcome. We appreciate you coming over.
Thank you, thank you. Just yesterday I was reading in the news that a gentleman spent 22 months, mostly in solitary confinement, and he was awarded $22 million in New Mexico. One of the things that happened when he revealed that he was mentally ill and somewhat depressed was that people got really worried that he would act out against himself. And so they put him in solitary confinement, and one of the things that came up was that he even pulled his own tooth when he required medical attention. Why do these things still happen?
They really shouldn't, and that's horrific, and that's why he was probably awarded $22 million in compensation, because the state got sued. But the bigger issue is that, sadly, the criminal justice system has become the primary mental health system in this country. Our jails are now the largest psychiatric warehouses in the country. I can't call them facilities because they're not really offering treatment. But in terms of raw numbers, on any given day in the United States, there's about 550,000 people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 900,000 on some type of community control. And so what's happened is we closed all the hospitals, we didn't provide the adequate and well-resourced community mental health system, and people that were acutely ill just moved into our system. And so as a court system, we're not built that way. We're not prepared on how to deal with those issues. And so what's finally starting to happen, which is wonderful, is that the court systems around the country are slowly building up capacity and slowly building up an infrastructure and educating ourselves that we shouldn't be treating someone with a mental illness this way. And my God, to have somebody 22 months on a DUI in solitary confinement on a serious mental illness, I'm sure exacerbated his illness in every way. And if he wasn't traumatized before, he certainly is now, and it's horrible. In some ways, our system was the absolute opposite, almost equally bad, until about 10 years ago. The way it used to work in Dade County, and some places in Florida it probably still does, is that if you got arrested on a misdemeanor and you were incompetent to stand trial, The county court judges, which are the lowest level of the trial courts in Florida, they don't have the legal authority to involuntarily hospitalize someone. And so what would happen is either they would stay in jail for a long period of time, but once they were determined not to be competent to stand trial, we would release them back to the street without any treatment, which is really bad also. I mean, you're putting the community at risk, you're putting the individual at risk. And so what we do here now, particularly in Miami, which is a wonderful system, is that if you do get arrested on a low-level misdemeanor offense and you have a serious mental illness, generally within 24 to 48 hours, we have you transferred to a crisis unit. And then we bring all kinds of services around you, and once you've been stabilized, we bring you back to court. And if it's a minor offense and you don't have a lot of priors, if you agree to go into treatment, after 2-3 months, the state drops the charges, and it works. And we're really reducing recidivism. The other thing that we've done here that is I'm really proud of is that we have trained over 3,600 police officers in Miami-Dade County in a program called Crisis Intervention Team Policing. And what that is a 40-hour training program that the court runs. And we take officers that are patrol officers and we teach them how to recognize someone who has a serious mental illness, how to de-escalate, and then where to take them as opposed to arresting them. And it started slow, but it has become the largest and the best program in the country. And just to give you an example, we have all 38 out of 38 agencies trained, including Department of Corrections. The air marshals have now approached us because they get a lot of cases when someone's under stress, acts out much more than they're getting terrorists, and so we're starting to train them. The immigration department is called and wants to get trained as well because they get a lot of those here too. And so the officers are in such a better position now because what we realize is that the police are generally trained that when they encounter someone who's aggressive, they're taught to become more aggressive to control the situation. And as you know, as a psychiatrist, if you have someone who's paranoid, by definition, and some guy in a uniform becomes aggressive to them, it becomes explosive, and something bad's going to happen. And we used to have in Dade County almost one person a month shot or killed with a mental illness by the police. And so this training has taught the officers, how to use de-escalation skills, how to use new language, how to look at a person, how much distance to keep. And they wear badges, too, that say CIT on it. And so a lot of the consumers recognize the CIT badge and immediately begin to de-escalate on their own.
So let me ask you this. I know you've been such a great advocate to help the mentally ill who come into the court system in some shape or form. Why don't you share with us a bit of how this got started for you?
Sure.
Because you've done so much work and these are the results, but you had to design a whole new system. You had to make sure that many people got trained so that then this served as a great attention attractor to other groups that have learned from you. Share with us a little bit about how you got involved in all of this and how you designed this system to help out.
Well, it was almost by accident. I knew nothing about mental illness. When I became a judge, there was absolutely no training about it. And, I got thrown into a courtroom, and I got thrown into a courtroom that's called the jail division. And we have 2 jail divisions now, and that's where you have 3 kinds of people in the jail division. Those are for people that have been charged with low-level offenses, misdemeanors, but are still in custody. Generally, somebody gets picked up on shoplifting or something like that, they're released immediately and they come back to court. But some people stay in jail. And the ones that stay in jail on low-level offenses are people that, A, have an attached felony and they're not allowed out, or they're too poor to bond out, or they have mental illness and they don't know how to get out. Well, one morning I was getting ready to go on the bench, and the assistant public defender and the assistant state attorney came in to see me, and they said, "Judge, we have this really sad case. The parents are outside. They really want to talk to you, and we'd appreciate if you talk to them about their son who is in jail on a case you're going to hear this morning." I'm like, "Sure, bring him in." Lovely, lovely people, incredibly sophisticated, but just distraught. And they start to tell me about their son, brilliant man. He'd gone to Harvard and I think Penn, and had a late onset of schizophrenia and was now homeless and recycling through the criminal justice system. And I was relatively new at the time, and I will tell you, when you're a new judge, you think you have a lot more wisdom and a lot more power than you really do. And I made the mistake of promising them that I would get their son help. I was under this false impression that if you were sick and you had a mental illness, we had some system to send you to. I just assumed. I mean, if you had a heart attack and you were sick, we would send you to a hospital, and that would be that. Well, as I was getting ready to get up and go into the courtroom, the mom stopped me and said, Judge, there's one more thing I want to tell you about my son. He's brilliant. He can be very manipulative, and it's because he knows the system better than anybody, because you see, Judge, my son is the former head of psychiatry at Jackson Memorial Hospital. And he had this horrible late onset. Young guy, he cashed in his life insurance policy one day, just didn't show up for it. And moved to Israel, and the Israelis deported him back here because he was committing quality of life offenses. And I, was stunned. And so I went to the courtroom and I called his case. And he was brilliant, and he knew more about the system than I did. By far, I knew nothing. And we started talking about his case, and he was very respectful, and he was polite. And if you listen to him, he sounded every bit the Harvard doctor he was. But if you looked at him, he looked like a homeless guy who hadn't bathed in 2 months. And so we started to talk, and he was in on some ridiculous offense. It wasn't even a Florida statute offense. I think it was a ordinance offense, like possession of a dairy cart or something. Mm-hmm. And he had already been in a couple of weeks, where no one, anyone on that charge wouldn't have even been brought to jail. So we're talking, having this great conversation, and I said to him, look, I'll consider releasing you if, you get some treatment. And he goes, well, there's nothing wrong with me. And I said, well, I just don't understand one thing. He's like, sure, Judge, anything. I'll answer anything you want. I said, well, I don't understand why a Harvard-educated doctor would be homeless and in jail if there wasn't some kind of mental illness. And whatever I said triggered a crisis. And all of a sudden, he started doing that shaking back and forth really hard, and he started hearing voices, and he started putting his hands over his ears, and he got the saddest, most frightening, contorted look. I'd never seen anybody like that. It's what I imagine someone must look like right before they're killed, because he had such fear on his face, and he started screaming at the top of his lungs. He started pointing violently to the back of the courtroom where his parents were standing, and he said, Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor, before I go any further, you have to remove that couple, you have to remove that couple. I'm like, aren't those your parents? He's like, no, 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 and he's screaming really loud, and the courtroom's like totally stunned. He goes, my real parents, they died in the Holocaust, and they're from the CIA, and they came to kill me. His parents were crying. It was horrible.
So you could see the paranoia right there in front of you with the whole crisis.
I saw the whole problem in 20
1
minutes.
second.
Exactly right. The whole system was right in front of my eyes. From the civil system not working for him to the criminal system not working for him. So I immediately ordered all these evaluations. And the first one came back, said he was incompetent. I needed 2 more, so I ordered 2 more. He's now in jail, 4 to 6 weeks on possession of a dairy cart. And I bring the lawyers in front of me. They stipulate to his incompetency. I begin to order him into involuntary hospitalization. And I noticed the assistant public defender kind of grinning. And she says to me, Your Honor, in all due respect, when lawyers say that to you, it has nothing to do with respect. She says, you can't do that. I said, what do you mean I can't do it? He's incompetent. I'm reading the evaluations. All 3 doctors say that not only is he incompetent, but he needs immediate hospitalization. He's a danger to himself or others, and we got to get this guy help. And plus, I promised his parents I'd get him help. Well, she hands me a Florida Supreme Court case that says that county court judges have no legal authority to involuntarily hospitalize anybody. And my only choice was to basically release him. I couldn't keep him in jail because I couldn't try him. He was incompetent. He wouldn't agree to do anything because he was sick. And I couldn't send him to a hospital because I had no legal authority.
You were also the victim of the
old
system.
Yes, of the insanity of the system. And I'll tell you, we don't become judges to be part of that problem, because think about what I'm about to do. I'm about to take a really sick man and release him right to the street, right in public all around. I'm putting him at risk. I'm putting the community at risk. You know, it's ridiculous. And so I left the bench that day pretty upset, and I started making some phone calls, and I learned 3 very valuable lessons. One was that Miami-Dade County has a real mental health crisis. We have the largest percentage of people with mental illnesses. You're in the right business in this community. Of any urban area in the United States. It's almost 3 times the national average. It's 9.1% of the general population in Miami-Dade has a serious mental illness, an SMI. It's about 155,000 adults and about 175,000 adults and about 55,000 children. And the state of Florida, who is now 50th out of 50 in providing community mental resources, only provides Dade County 1% mental health treatment. And so what's happened is the Dade County Jail has become the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida. 3 of our 9 jail floors are now mental health floors. The county spends about $160,000 a day, about $60 million a year, to warehouse them in this horrible, horrifying place that is built in 1956, I think. It's terribly outdated, it's cruel, it's overcrowded, and it exacerbates illnesses all the time because they're not treated very well. And because it's not conducive for treatment, people generally stay there about 8 times longer at about 7 times the cost because we don't know what to do with them. And that was the first lesson. And and since 1999, we've had about 20 people with a serious mental illness killed during an encounter with the police. And it was just, it's ridiculous. We have about 1,200 people a day on psychotropic medication in the jail. The second thing I learned that day was that it wasn't just a Dade County problem, but it turned out to be a state and national problem. And that we are just, we just don't know what to do. So the police arrest them, we hold them, and then release them back to the community without a lot of support. And then the third lesson, and maybe the crueler lesson, is that our system is really built on this 40, 50-year-old idea that is really outdated. It's based on old science, old medicine, old philosophies that are not really applicable. And so we've created this perfect storm. And it wasn't created by one person, one party, one anything. It's just perfect storm. And we closed all of our state hospitals for the most part. In 1955, there were about 560,000 people in state hospitals. And if you use today's population, it would come out to about 1.5 million people. In 1955, we had about 5,000 people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prison. Since 55, we've closed 90% of the hospital beds. And I'm not saying we need to go back to that route. It's just that we never created a community system to absorb them as they came out of jail. And, President Kennedy actually had a wonderful piece of legislation passed. In fact, it was his last public bill signing before he was assassinated that would have created this national network of community mental health systems. His sister had been lobotomized. They were very sensitive to the issue. And so he tried to set up this great community system. Well, because of his assassination in the Vietnam War, they never funded it. And at the same time, the courts, because of the horrific treatment that was going on in many of these state hospitals, basically ordered them to straighten up or close. And they didn't want to spend the money, so they closed. And so you had almost overnight this massive group of people go from hospitals to a non-existent community system, bypassing any supports and ending up in the criminal justice system. And so last year there were about 1.5 million people with serious mental illnesses arrested, and as I already stated, there's about 500,000 in jail and prison on any given day, and another 900,000 on some type of probation. So, I just couldn't sit by and keep doing that. And so, one of the nice things about being a judge, it's good to be judge, you can bring people together who ordinarily don't talk and don't necessarily want to talk. And so we had this 2-day summit that I organized at Jackson Memorial, and we brought all the traditional and non-traditional stakeholders. It was based on a wonderful technical grant we got from, it's called the Gain Center. They're kind of the wonderful gurus in the nation on this issue. And they really helped us put a plan together. And through this 2-day meeting, we decided we needed to do two things. We needed a pre-arrest type of diversion, because the court system should not be the default system. And you don't want to create a system where we're offering such wonderful opportunity that people want to get arrested to get services. So we needed a pre-arrest, and we based it on this crisis intervention team program that began in Memphis. We really liked the model. The police were very reticent to do it.
So you had to convince several stakeholders.
Yes, and remember, Dade County is a huge county, and we have like 38 different police agencies, which is like 38 different cultures, and I'm a civilian to them, and getting them to do it was a really big deal. It was very, very difficult at first, and I think at the time I was living on the beach. I knew the mayor, pretty progressive area, and they were willing to try it just because I bugged them, and it started to look promising.
So the personal connection was what...
Yes, that's what helped get Miami Beach going, and then the other agencies started to watch. And then sadly, we had a really, really horrible tragedy in the city of Miami. A guy by the name of Richard Beatty. I remember his name well because I released him from jail. This was a Vietnam veteran. He was harmless. He suffered from severe PTSD, but he was this big, burly kind of guy and looked kind of scary. And he used to walk around here, and he used to walk right across the 12th Street Bridge over into Little Havana. And one night, there used to be a restaurant right on the other side of the bridge, and he was peering into the window, and he was holding his little penknife. And somebody saw him and called the police. And they weren't trained, and they came out, and they did everything wrong. And they escalated it and escalated, and it was a 4-hour standoff. And they pepper sprayed him, and they tried to hit him with batons, and they had all these officers surround him, and they literally followed him in a circle over the bridge, and he ended up back underneath the highway in the parking lot like 1 in the morning across from where you are right now. And after 4 hours, he lunged at one of the officers with his knife and tried to stab the officer in the neck, and they shot him 14 times and killed him. Because they didn't know he was a veteran. They didn't know he had mental illness. Because they weren't trained.
They didn't know what to do.
They didn't know what to do. And I'd been begging them to get trained. And to the credit of the then police chief, when they found out, and the officers felt terrible when they found out he was a vet, came in and said, "We get it. Tell us how to fix it." And now Miami has one of the best CIT programs in the country. And they went from that agency alone, one shooting a month, to maybe 1 or 2 in the last 4 years. And I don't have all the data in from last year, but what I was told last week is just the city of Miami and Miami-Dade, which are 2 of the 38 agencies, they handled 10,000 mental health calls and made a handful of arrests. And so as a result, what's happening, and most of the people they encountered who were sick, they're trained on how to Baker Act someone or involuntarily hospitalize someone. They take them to a crisis unit. And so our jail audit has had the largest drop in the United States last year because of what the police officers are able to do. And they love it. I mean, you ought to hear their stories. They're like social workers now, and they feel so good about, being an officer again and helping people. It just has had all the right outcomes for everybody.
So the understanding has really come to a different level so that people can participate in a different way.
And they're like military in a way. If they know they have to get trained, they do it.
They do it. Now it's part of the check.
And now it's part of the check. But they like it. They're not getting hurt as much. They realize there must have been a better way to deal with this population. It's helping destigmatize the issue for them. And you know what you find, which is so interesting, because we have such a high percentage of people with mental illness in Dade County, when you train 3,600 officers, they have a lot of family members too with mental illness, and that's why they volunteer for this program. I have a wonderful woman who does the training, Hopsy Kaba. She's amazing. She is the best trainer I've ever met, and they love her. But she gets 100, 150 calls a month from law enforcement officers on their own family situation and needing advice on how to handle it, because it's not easy. It's a tough disease, and even with the best training, if you don't have the resources to get people treatment, it's very difficult.
And the good news is that if they can then resolve conflict with severely mentally ill people, they can easily resolve conflict with other people too.
And that's what's happened. Their use of force in all their agencies is way down.
Right.
Because they're now using their nonverbal skill to talk to everybody. You don't have to have a mental illness to be able to.
Right. I don't have to show
Right,
that I can
exactly.
more. It's like, okay, let's keep it cool. Let's
Right.
chat about this.
And most people respond right.
Yes,
And
people.
Right. And if they're not, then they know what they have to do. But it works really, really well. So it's been a huge success. Now, the other things that we've done, which have been equally successful, is we set up we have 2 post-arrest diversion programs, one in the misdemeanor division and one in the felony division. So now what happens if that psychiatrist had come back to me today and he was floridly psychotic like he was, we would not have ordered all those evaluations. I would have had a doctor at the jail scene see him within minutes of his arrest. The doctor would have issued a professional certificate. The court, within 24 to 48 hours max, would sign an order. Department of Corrections would transport him to a crisis stabilization unit, and because they're under a criminal hold, the 72 hours doesn't apply. So we reset it for 2 weeks. We really get them stabilized. While they're in there, the lawyers are looking at their history and their case. A plan is put together, and if they agree to treatment, the state generally drops the charges after a few months. And it's unbelievable. Our recidivism rate dropped from about 72% to about 20%. And we just got a huge grant from a foundation to take us to the next level. Because what we have found is there is a smaller population, really, really acutely ill, mostly schizophrenics, who are have been very resistant to the type of programming that we've had out there. And we did this study with the Florida Mental Health Institute last year, and it was mind-boggling. I asked them to look. They have these great computer systems, and they have the ability to look at Baker Acts, Medicaid records, criminal justice records, you name it, all in one. And so they can tell who the highest utilizers of criminal justice mental health services are in the state. And so I said, well, do it for Dade County, because I'm figuring they're going to come up with a couple thousand people, you know, we have such a high rate, blah, blah, blah. They narrowed it down to 97 people.
Wow.
These 97, primarily men, primarily with a schizophrenic diagnosis, over a 5-year period were arrested almost 2,200 times.
Wow.
Spent 27,000 days in the Dade County Jail, 13,000 days either at an emergency room, crisis unit, or psychiatric facility, and cost taxpayers almost $13 million. We would have been better off sending them to Harvard. I mean, we got nothing for it. Nothing. And so what this grant's going to enable us to do is to offer a higher level of service and cognitive behavioral treatments, which we think is a missing component for some of the individuals that get arrested. There seems to be what research is showing us a criminogenic factor, that even if they didn't have a mental illness, they might end up over here because they live in zip codes with high crime rates, high illiteracy rates, they have a substance use problem on top of their mental illness, and they think like a criminal. And so not only do we now have to deal with their mental illness, we also have to address the criminogenic issues. And so we're very excited to test this out and evaluate it and see if we're able to really get after that next 20% of this high utilizer.
And you can compare it beautifully.
Yes. And that's what we're doing. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to do treatment as is now with one group, and we'll have a real apples and apples. Exactly. So we're very, very excited about it. And then we also have a felony diversion program. And so for individuals who are getting arrested on low-level felonies, and you know, the thing that people need to understand when they're looking at this isn't about a free pass out of jail. The way we look at it, and this is very simple, but it makes a lot of sense. If you're in jail because of your mental illness, we want to get you out as quick as we can and get you treated. If you're in jail in spite of your mental illness, then you have to face your consequences. You know what you were doing, and you have to, you know, pay the penalty.
Because both things can happen.
And both things can happen. And so this isn't about, you know, just some do-gooder social program. It's about doing the right thing for the right reason with really good outcomes that are going to improve our public safety, save a lot of taxpayer money, and really help people who are just here because they're sick get into recovery and get their lives back. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate, but you can recover from mental illness. There's not a cure, but some of the data tells me that recovery rates are better for people with mental illness than diabetes. And so you really have to have a good system of care, continuum of care, and a lot of this population can actually do relatively well.
Well, one of the things that you tapped into is time. And in this healthcare arena, where we expect people to bounce back in a couple of days, we realize that those people who are severely mentally ill and who are in that revolving door, just like you mentioned, they're not going to get well in 2 days. They may not get well in 2 weeks.
Or in 2 months.
Or in
2
2
years. I mean, but they need a
They need the
roadmap
care.
to recovery. That's right. And sometimes it takes a brilliant pharmacologist to figure out the right mix of medication. Sometimes, in one of the studies that we participated in nationally, which, again, mind-boggling, that we really were not prepared for, is that almost 100% of the women who are in jail or prison with serious mental illness have serious trauma issues, and about 75% of the men. Well, very few communities have any trauma-related services. Most of these women were sexually abused as children. The brain waves have been altered. They're hearing voices. They're having schizoaffective type disorder. They self-medicate themselves with cocaine to get rid of the voices. They then go to prostitution to pay for the drugs, and they spend their entire adult lives in the criminal justice system, and they were victims themselves as children, and it's horrifying. And so what we're doing now is we've added a trauma track, and we evaluate now for trauma. And we just have gotten so much more sophisticated. When all I wanted to do was get one doctor out of jail who had a mental illness, it's become this massive, massive program.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind out of what we see in the media. One is some violent acts perpetrated by ill moms, by killing their kids and then killing themselves.
Right.
So you can see how some of their mental illness has not been addressed. And the other one is with kids who commit mass murder and they're mentally ill too.
Although, a couple things, and I really want to address that.
Perfect.
Because number one is people with serious mental illnesses are much, much more likely to be a victim of a violent crime than a perpetrator, because most people with mental illness are not organized enough to go out and do something. And so when there is any violence, it's usually reaction. It's they're reacting to a hallucination or some stimuli that someone did that set them off. They're not planning, And the other part that I really want to point out that I don't think most people understand, and you could certainly do this better than me, there is a real difference between a sociopath or a psychopath and someone who has an Axis 1 mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or major depression. And the people that we're dealing with in our system that we try to screen out or screen for are people with the Axis 1 disorder. If you're a psychopath or a sociopath and you're competent,
You know what you're doing. You know you're
you need to be in
perpetrating
jail,
evil.
and it's usually a personality. It's an Axis 2 disorder anyway. I want them off the street, and I want them in jail. They're dangerous, and we really don't have a lot of tools for them. But if you're, bipolar or schizophrenic, and you're homeless, and an officer comes up to you and scares you, and you put your hands on him, I don't need to send him to prison. I need to get him treated. And the police have finally come around to understanding that, because it's a lot better to get this guy treated and off the street as a homeless person than out there committing these kinds of problems. So, people get very confused. And the other thing is, we have about 170 murders a year in Miami-Dade County. How many do you think are committed by people with mental illness? 2 or 3. Most of the murders are committed by sane people. So, TV and media do a really bad job of dramatizing, and people get scared, and they don't know the difference between a sociopath and somebody with a serious mental illness, and they're all lumped in. And so we're very careful. We know what we're doing. We screen, and we don't want dangerous people back on the street either. But if you're here just because you're sick, and there's no indication in your past that you are violent, you're a good candidate to get diverted and into treatment.
And this speaks to how much of the stigma still exists among people. It's kind of easier to say, wow, they may be dangerous because they're acting weird. Whereas in fact, they may be, like you were mentioning before, they may be more of the victims of other people who will hit them. Like we know people have hit homeless people who were not doing anything to anyone else.
Or they may live in an ALF with other people with mental illness and there's a problem. I mean, it's tough. So, and it's cool. I mean, and you know, you see them, and the best is when they come back after they're treated. And sometimes it's like someone has flipped a switch in their brain and they've come back and they've gone back to work and they're in recovery.
I trained in the D.C. area and at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. We did have community centers there, and we had different levels of care. Interestingly, we were also the dump of the city. Even the VAs, whenever they did not want any patient or they couldn't treat anyone, or even the other hospitals around, whether it was GW or Georgetown, they would send those people to us. One of my most difficult patients was also a vet with bipolar illness and PTSD, extremely violent. He actually was hunting to kill me. And it wasn't until months later that we finally got his medications okay and he got to be okay, that he approached me and said, you know, I realize that you were trying to help me, but this is now. Before, I really wanted to kill you, and you should have taken better care of yourself because I could have. What was interesting in that situation was that as much as he was a vet and he was trying to kill me, we also had another vet who was a nurse. And because he realized I was under fire in a way, he would always watch my back.
Wow.
So it is interesting to see that was probably one of the hardest patients that I've ever had. I was really trying to help him, and thank goodness he realized about that, but he couldn't tell at the time that he was so upset, so ill. There were 2 weeks in which he was awake, screaming out loud and violent, straight
24 hours a day.
24 hours a day, day and night, no sleep. And sometimes you wonder, wow, does that even exist? And you're like, yes. And you can tell the difference when you are able to stabilize someone that they don't mean it.
And that's one of the saddest part of the illness. There's no insight. And one of the problems that we see is when they go off their medication, a lot of them don't realize they've gotten sick again. We're the crazy ones at that point. And it makes it so much more difficult. And that's why I really think that we need to take a good hard look at our commitment laws. And my sense is we need to study it a lot more and see how effective or ineffective they really are today. We know just in Florida through a study I saw, if you're Baker Acted more than twice a year, there's a 90% chance you're going to get arrested. I mean, the system is not really doing what it was intended to do, and I think what people need to understand is these are like heart attacks of the brain. And they're silent heart attacks. They don't feel it. And they feel fine. And they're acting out, and they have to then come to a court for the court to decide if they should be treated. Now, if you had a heart attack, no one would ask you if you want to get treated. They would rush you to a hospital. They would do everything they can to resuscitate you. And then if you want to go back eating like a jerk later, that's your choice. But with mental illness, we don't do that. And there also seems to be some growing research, and I don't think it's definitive yet, but the longer we take to get someone stable, the greater possibility there may be some permanent damage. And so our system is really a mess. And so some people who are going through it again and again are getting really bad brain damage from this. And then it becomes even more difficult to get them serviced. And, you know, I tell people there's nothing civil or right about letting somebody live under a dumpster and eat garbage and say that's a civil right. So I really think we need to take some new looks at this. I'm not into rehospitalizing, reinstitutionalizing people, but I think we have to stop looking at a psychiatric hospital as a bad thing. They're not what they were 50 years ago. And if you need to go, if you, God forbid, have cancer or heart disease and it gets worse, you go to a hospital and get a higher level of care.
Or to a rehab center, or to hospice, or...
That's right. And if your mental illness gets worse, you need a tune-up too, and you may need to get the higher level of service, not for long-term institutionalization, but just to get you stable again. and then back out into the community. And we're not there yet. We still have this extreme system, which is very expensive, and it doesn't really work very well.
The other thing that always affects mental illness in this case is that it's not just the medical part, but there's so much of the social part too. And it looks like that social part is either dumped on the legal system or on the healthcare system, but it's really not where it should be built in a different way too.
I know, because we don't look at them as people. And we tend to apply a criminal justice model as opposed to a disease model. We wait until they get really, really sick and then end up in an acute system, whether it be an emergency room, a crisis unit, or a jail, to start to get services. Where if we treated it like a disease and there's an early onset and we start to get you treated, recovery rates are much, much better. And we don't do that in this country, and that's part of the problem, that it's costing us so much money.
Just like you were saying before, if you know someone is having a heart attack, you want to intervene as fast as possible.
Right.
You're not going to let that person have the heart attack for 2 or 3 days.
Oh, plus the organ's getting damaged every second's going by. Well, this organ's getting damaged too.
So the faster and the better.
Right.
With an eye in the future, what do you foresee will happen in the system in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, what I'm hopeful, and I'm just an optimistic person, but I'm seeing it. For the last 10 years, we have been building a wonderful infrastructure across this country on starting to teach judges all across the country. And they've become such wonderful advocates because they're in a neutral, they're like Switzerland. They don't offend anybody, they have access, they can bring people together, and they're on the front line, and they're understanding this, and they know there's a better way to do it. And we have like 500 judges nationally starting to do what we're doing here. And so I'm very optimistic that more diversion, mental health courts are starting to be established. We're doing a lot of work with the VA now, and because we have a lot of vets coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with severe PTSD, and the numbers of the arrests are through the roof, and we're really trying to do that. So from long term, I think we're going to get more sophisticated and work more towards treatment than incarceration. But I'm also optimistic and hopeful that our medical field will become more sophisticated, and we'll have some kind of imaging tests to be able to determine schizophrenia, and we'll treat it more like the disease it is because we'll have tests for it, and we'll really be able to have better ideas. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, probably slower than I'd like it. But, and I think the other thing that might be promising is you have these long-term injectables that if they don't have side effects and they're effective, might be a good way, for particularly for this very difficult population that's recycling. Yeah. So, I'm cautiously optimistic.
But things are coming
together. But they are coming together, and they're coming together well. And for the first time, money is being, that's how I know it's working. Money is finally being put in through foundations. Some of the industry are really starting to step up for the first time. The American Psychiatric Association is really stepping into this in a big way. And so I think it's very encouraging. And so I'm encouraged. And I hope that in 10 years I'm out of the business of mental health, that someone doesn't have to get arrested to get care, and that it's a last resort for someone with acute mental illness to come in front of me, not a first. And that's where we are today.
Judge Leifman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you have enjoyed episode 8 and the interview with Judge Leifman as much as I have. And there's much food for thought after this episode. There's several issues that we discussed aside from severe mental illness here that I want you to really reflect upon and think about. But there's a couple of additional issues that I think are very important here that you can reflect upon in your own life. One of them is there anything that you're truly passionate about? Is there anything that's really dear to your heart? And do you feel alone as an advocate for this very tough theme? If there's anything that has inspired me, I hope that this has inspired you too, is to realize that you're not alone, but that it is extremely important to try to bring in a coalition of like-minded individuals. Or if they're not like-minded individuals yet, maybe start a coalition of people who will directly benefit from some of the things that are truly dear to your heart. So in the spirit of collaboration and advocacy, try to see how you can bring all of this together, how you can bring all the players together around the table so that you can at least get started with a good conversation. Other lessons learned here is nothing happens from one day to the next, and less so when you're trying to bring some huge changes within society, within the social aspects, within healthcare, or even within the legal system. Things do take time. But at the same time, the more that you can plan ahead, try to see how is it that I can plan ahead? How is it that you can bring all the important heads together so that you can all try to come to terms with some joint purpose, with some joint heart there that will help you advance together in your quest for advocacy and collaboration. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.